It's strange how the mind insists on turning uncertainty into a puzzle to solve, as if clarity can be forced through sheer mental effort, as if peace is the reward for solving every riddle life throws at us. But life isn't a riddle and peace isn't a prize. It's a presence. And yet the mind resists presence because presence asks for surrender, not strategy. It asks us to stop measuring moments by their outcomes and start meeting them as they are. But that terrifies the part of us that equates control with safety. So it scrambles, it scans, it plans, not out of wisdom but out of fear. It whispers that something will go wrong unless you're 10 steps ahead. But that whisper becomes a roar, and that roar becomes your soundtrack. And suddenly you're not living, you're bracing. You're performing mental gymnastics, trying to stabilize what was never unstable in the first place. Because reality isn't chaos, it's just unfiltered, but we've been taught to fear the unfiltered. We've been trained to cover silence with sound, to fill gaps with guesswork, to smother openness with preparation, as if tension is the only thing keeping the roof from collapsing. But tension is not strength, it's strain. And over time, that strain becomes the lens through which we see everything. Every delay feels like doom. Every pause feels like punishment. Every unknown feels like a failure to predict. But what if none of that was true? What if the unknown wasn't the enemy? What if it was the invitation? What if you could be with life not as a strategist, but as a witness, not constantly intervening, but intimately attuned? Because life isn't asking you to outthink it, it's asking you to meet it. And meeting it requires a different kind of intelligence, not the kind that calculates, but the kind that listens, the kind that doesn't panic in the pause, the kind that knows that not every quiet is a threat and not every feeling needs to be fixed. We spend so much of our lives trying to secure things that were never meant to be held so tightly. Outcomes, approval, certainty. But the truth is, the more you try to grip life into submission, the more it slips through your fingers. Not because life is cruel, but because it's fluid. It was never meant to be gripped, it was meant to be moved with. And yet we brace against it as if preparing for some inevitable storm. We tighten our bodies, we tighten our thoughts, we tighten our hearts. And in doing so, we lose the very flexibility we need to navigate what comes. There's a quiet kind of suffering that builds from always anticipating, always adjusting, always trying to stay one move ahead of a game that isn't even being played. And the cost of that suffering is subtle but deep. You begin to forget what it feels like to be at ease. You forget what it means to trust the moment you're in. You forget how to listen without reaching for conclusions, how to breathe without rehearsing the next emergency, how to rest without guilt scratching at the edge of your peace. And all the while life is still here, offering itself to you in small sacred ways, in the way sunlight dances across a wall, in the way someone looks at you when they feel safe, in the stillness between words. But you miss it, not because you don't care, but because your attention has been hijacked by false urgency. And that's what chronic worry really is, a false urgency. A looping narrative that says, if you're not alert, you're not safe. But alertness and anxiety are not the same thing. One makes you aware, the other makes you afraid. And when you're afraid, you stop seeing clearly. You start seeing everything as a potential problem. You become suspicious of silence. You read danger into delay. You imagine rejection in every pause. And your life slowly begins to feel like a crisis that never actually arrives. But what if you interrupted that story? What if, in the middle of that loop, you paused and reminded yourself, this isn't danger, this is discomfort, and I can hold that? Because that's the difference between fear and maturity. Not the absence of discomfort, but the willingness to feel it without collapsing. You learn to soften your grip. You learn to tell the difference between intuition and insecurity. You start showing up to your own life, not as someone on the run, but as someone ready to receive. You don't need to rehearse every possibility. You don't need to fortify your heart like a bunker. You need to be here, right now, as you are, because most of the time that's more than enough. The irony is, the more we try to protect ourselves from pain, the more we end up disconnecting from joy. Not because joy is unavailable, but because the same walls that block out fear also dim the light. You can't selectively numb emotion. When you numb anxiety, you also dull your capacity for wonder. When you shield yourself from heartbreak, you also muffle the resonance of love. And over time, you stop feeling much at all, just a low hum of caution, a kind of emotional static that follows you everywhere. It's the sound of never quite relaxing, never quite trusting, never quite letting go. You call it being responsible, you call it being realistic, but deep down it's just fear in a suit, fear with a checklist, fear dressed as discipline. And it's exhausting, not because life is exhausting, but because the performance of safety is. All the internal calculations, all the hidden catastrophes your mind builds behind your eyes, all the futures you live through in your head while the present moment waits, untouched, unlived. The truth is, most of your exhaustion isn't coming from what's happening, it's coming from what you're holding, mentally, emotionally, energetically. And the wildest part, most of what you're holding was never even yours. Expectations, projections, old programming passed down like heirlooms. You carry them as if they're facts, as if being constantly on edge is just part of being a grown-up. But it's not. It's just a habit, one that can be unlearned, one that must be unlearned if you want to feel the fullness of being alive. Because presence isn't passive, it's powerful. It's what allows you to meet life without flinching, to sit in uncertainty without being swallowed by it, to hear your own voice even when the world is loud. But presence can't coexist with constant prediction. It's not something you manufacture by fixing everything. It's something you access by pausing, breathing, and allowing the moment to be what it is, even when it's messy, even when it's unclear, even when it doesn't match the script your mind prefers. There's a quiet strength in that kind of presence, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself, doesn't rush to fill silence, doesn't crumble when plans fall apart. It's not loud, it's not performative. It's the strength of someone who has stopped needing the world to be predictable in order to feel safe, someone who has stopped needing certainty to feel calm. That kind of presence doesn't come from mastering every detail. It comes from releasing the illusion that you ever could. It comes from choosing again and again to return to your center instead of chasing control. And in doing that, you begin to notice something. Life doesn't actually require as much force as you thought it did. It doesn't need to be micromanaged to unfold. It just needs your presence. Because when you're truly here, not lost in projection, not bracing for disappointment, life becomes more navigable, not easier necessarily, but clearer. You begin to respond rather than react. You begin to trust rather than tense. You begin to listen, not just to others, but to yourself. That still steady part of you that's been whispering beneath the noise all along, you're okay. You're already okay. And when you start listening to that voice, something shifts. You begin to move with a different kind of rhythm, less frantic, more deliberate, less driven by what if, and more guided by what is. You stop needing to prepare for every worst-case scenario because you've built a quiet trust in your ability to meet what comes. You know now that your peace doesn't come from having all the answers, but from your willingness to face the questions without losing your balance. That's the difference. Not that the questions disappear, but that they no longer uproot you. You remain, you breathe, you soften, you show up.